Welcome to our unit for price. Price is really the last component of the marketing mix. And one of the most important things to remember about price is that it's the only element within that marketing mix that actually brings revenues into the organization. If you recall the other three, promotion, place, and product, new product development, those are costing money to the organization. That they are the kind of investment you need to do to move your business forward. However, that money will be recovered through this final P, the P for price. It is also the most flexible in the sense that any mistake that you do in any other three other components, let's say you make a mistake in your advertisement campaign and the campaign is out, you have already spent the money in that campaign. So it's hard to actually make the changes. However, if you price your product in a way that is not really successful, you can make changes to the price pretty easy, pretty quick. And this is obviously a personal opinion, but if you ask me, it's the most complicated because there are so many factors that are impacting your pricing that it is hard to come out with a perfect, definition of, value for the customer and how much they're willing to pay. So let me challenge you with that exercise. And let me get that out of there. I hope you didn't read it. But if I ask you, what do you think is the minimum price that an organization should be charging for their product? What is that floor? I mean, common sense will tell you, as you were saying before, is that it will be your product cost, right? You don't wanna sell under cost. Although, of course, companies at some point, if they're doing like a promotional pricing, they might decide to sell under cost to gain some market share. But once in business, you want to at least cover your costs. If I ask you now, what do you think is the most a company can charge for a product? That's when it gets really tricky, because you might not like this answer. What's happening is that you can charge as much of the perception of value, not even the value that you're offering, but the perception by your consumer of that value. That's your price ceiling. And you will see that if you overprice, there's not going to be demand for your product. And then in the middle, to actually narrow down the price, what you're going to see is a lot of components. Like I was telling you before, you need to know what are your goals, you need to understand the nature of your market, your consumer demand, and of course what your competitors with similar value propositions are doing, and how much they are charging, because your consumer is always going to compare your value proposition, your price, with the one of your competitors. So very tricky, but always remember this price floor and this price ceiling. Let's see what your book actually called the pricing framework, which is really the process of defining your pricing strategy. The first thing you want to do is obviously define your objectives. And you might ask me, well, isn't the objective to make money? And I will say yes, but I want you to read this list and understand that sometime when we're defining our price, we are trying to generate different effect, and we have different goals, okay? And it might be obviously the straightforward, we want to generate X number of sales in revenue, or we want to gain this X percentage of market share. We might be driven by profit, not so much by revenue number. We might decide that in our industry, the consumer, like car, is getting tired of the bargaining and the hustle, so we move into a no haggle price like Saturn did. We can even try to generate competitive effects, and there is a very interesting case from the 70s where Smirnoff and Walt Smith, they were head to head and the same quality and the same price. So what the Walt Smith people decided to do was to actually decrease the price in $1 in an effort exactly to gain market share, right? I sell cheaper, so logic will tell you I'm going to sell more. But what Smirnoff did, what do you think they did? Pause here for a second. Did they bring their prices down? They decided, actually, I'm giving you clues here, to increase their product. So what they were doing is by these $2 difference that they generate, they were increasing the perception of value because the consumer start to associate that most expensive vodka with a better quality. And on the top of separating themselves from the competitors, they also create a cheaper version to actually compete head to head with the Walsmith. So it was a very smart movement done by Smirnoff. And of course, because there is this consumer perception, remember our unit in consumer behavior, that most expensive things are better quality. And in watches, we see that over and over. Why someone will pay $150,000 for this Patek Philippe is because obviously there is driven by that prestige and the exclusivity that come from being one of the few that actually can afford this kind of price. Okay, so let's move through these steps. Estimate demand, you have to know your costs, you need to understand what's happening in your environment, and you finally go to pick the final strategy and the specific tactics. And of course, like in any process that we have learned in the class, at the end you wanna check your metric and make adjustments based on results. So let's talk about estimate demand. And what is demand goes back to also unit one when we talk about want, need, and demand. And the key part with demand is not only that the consumer has that desire for the product, but it has the resource to pay for it. And it's very tricky because for some product, marketers have become very sophisticated about calculating demand, but once in a while you find a product that is either unique, and I'm giving you a very fun example here because this is an auction that took place a few years ago in New York, and the pieces that were auctioned, believe it or not, were part of Mahatma Gandhi belongings, and among those was a watch. So they didn't have really any reference to establish the starting bid, and they didn't know how much to charge. So if I recall properly, the starting bid was $50,000. They thought anything between, 50 and 100,000 would be a good price to pay for it. But to their surprise, and there is a long story behind, that watch and the sandals and the teacup and the glasses got sold for $2 million. So just an extreme case of how do you price something that there is really no previous history and is unique big. Very interesting pricing in art and collector pieces. I'm sure you're familiar from other classes, but when you want to estimate demand, the first thing you want to be familiar is with the law of demand, that is basically telling you pure logic that the more expensive something is, the less demand is going to be for that. So where we like to talk in marketing is what we call total demand. And total demand is obviously the number of potential buyers times the number of unit each buyer is going to buy within a period. And as you can imagine, if you're calculating the number of cereal boxes, you are going to say, well, it usually take a family of 4 a whole week to finish my boxes. So within this potential number of buyers, you multiply by 52, right? But if you are selling something like an iPhone, you're going to see that people only change their iPhones every year or every 2 other years. So this will be a smaller multiplier. So when I have that total demand, what you want to know is my company, right? Because here we're talking about the total market. What percentage of that total market I think my company can capture? Okay, so it's a percentage you're applying over your total demand. And it gets really tricky. So I'm just mentioning here for you to know that marketers may use a model called ATAR, which is basically based on primary research. You run surveys and you come out with these different multipliers. You find out the awareness, the trial intention, availability of your product, and repeat intention to come out with that forecasted number. All companies sometimes they engage in what we call a top-down approach, which is we just described. How big is my total market and what percentage I think I can capture. Obviously, if you are a company that already has a history, one way to forecast your sales for the year is to just look back to the numbers that you saw last year, and then you're going to, assuming the economy obviously is favorable, you're going to apply also a percentage growth. So usually, again, in existing companies, it's easier to do this forecast. When it becomes really tricky is when you are launching a new business. But you need to be familiar with these numbers because they're going to help you establish your pricing. The third step you want to take is obviously to determine cost, and I'm not going to go into the process of calculating your break even, but I want you to understand that when you talk about cost, you obviously have what we call the fixed costs, and those are the costs of production or delivering that don't change based on the number of units that you are selling. But on the contrary, the variable costs, those are totally related to the number of units that you are selling. Okay, so the more you sell, usually you engage in economies of scale, so the cheaper is to buy those variable costs. So your total cost will be obviously those fixed costs, the ones you are going to spend no matter what, time plus, those variable costs per unit times the number of units. And in business at the end, if you want to make more money, it's all about either increasing your price and reducing your expensive. And very easy to say and harder to do. But the equation of how companies make the profit, it gets simplified to really do those two components. Let me walk you quick through the step 4, in which you want to be familiar what's happening around you, and that means obviously be familiar what cycle we are within the economy, how inflation is doing, currency fluctuation, very interesting now where with the euro is going, what your competitors are doing, and of course what consumer trends are out there. If green and organic movement is hot, you might want to be able to capitalize on that and charge more for your product. And I just introduced you here the LOHA segment, lifestyles of healthy habit and sustainability. So that's a good segment to keep in mind because they're willing to pay a lot of money. Choose a price strategy either based on cost, which we see this a lot. You calculate your cost and then you add a markup. Or other companies prefer to move into what we call strategies based on demand, and we have two different types. Target costing, when companies will define IKEA and Honda, that's the example I have there, they do that. They say, okay, this consumer is willing to pay $500 for this table. So they go back to the design board and they create a product that fit within that $100 price tag. So they reverse the process. They don't just start with the cost and add a markup, but this is our final price, was the less we can spend obviously in manufacturing that. Just be familiar with this, the idea of the everyday low pricing, and Fresh and Easy and Walmart are good examples. They just claim they have the lowest price and it's not a promotional effort. They have it all year round. New product, 2 ways to product your new product, either a skimming where you charge a lot or a high price at the beginning, and this will be the type of product that will benefit from a skimming price, or exactly the opposite. In order to gain a good market share, you enter very low, and once your consumer has tried you, you increase your pricing. The final one is what we call the tactics, and I'm sure you have experienced this in many occasions where we'll have a two-part pricing. You pay for the hardware in your phone, and then you have your monthly plan, or payment pricing where they break the price